Good morning, brothers and sisters. Welcome to day 2 of our HESED lecture series. We are absolutely blessed and excited to have you all here with us. I am Pastor JD, as most of my folks call me. I serve here as the Dean of Enrollment, right downstairs with an awesome team. You've probably seen Andrew. He was helping check people in. We love this lecture series. We love the student learning. We love the voices that are here. And we just love that everybody is joining us this day. Let us open with prayer. Gracious and merciful God, we are so unbelievably moved by your nearness. We are so grateful for the pieces of your creation, like Austin Seminary, where we are able to freely gather, learn, grow, dream. God, we are just humbled by what you can create when your servants are willing to lean out and lean in. But Lord, remind us that the lust for vengeance and hatred and greed that the world has not ceased, has not died down. That while we gather here in a safe and comfortable environment, free to speak our hearts, there are so many that are silenced. There are those that are fearful to speak out. Imbue in us your passion, O God, not just for the least, the last, and the lost, O Lord, but for a hunger to continue to fire up in us, that we desire your HESED. That we remember the blessing of this place and this learning, and that we continue to go out from here doing your work for all of our days and all of our ways. In your holy and gracious name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. At Forum, Latin Theology Project, co-producer of the documentary Faith in Blackness and Exploration of the AfroLatine Spirituality, co-host of the podcast Guesnerth Perea, and associate pastor of Metro Hope Church. His writings on Afro-Latinidad have been part of the various publications, including Let Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora, the Revista de Estudios Colombianos, and most recently, Engaging Religion, a digital journal by the Indiana University. Josue was once named by the newspaper Am New York as one of the 5 Colombians making a mark in New York City. Josue holds an MA in theology from Alliance Theological Seminary and a BA in Latin American history from the City College of New York. Can we give an APTS welcome to Josue? Thank you so much.
Buenos días. I would like a moment to remember the ancestors on whose shoulders we stand on. Ancestors like, for me, Miriam Jimenez Roman, Juan Flores, and my father, Flores Miro Perea Renteria. These are just a few of the many people who have paved the way for us. And we are eternally grateful for their leadership and guidance in our lives. So let's take a moment for yourself to remember an ancestor that meant a lot to you, that brought you to this moment today. Thank you. I also want to offer gratitude to the student leadership group here at Austin Seminary. Let's give the group a round of applause. From the bottom of my heart, I want to express my deepest gratitude for your partnership in bringing this film, our film, Faith in Blackness, to Austin Seminary. But it's very clear that your dedication, your passion, and commitment to discussing spirituality and faith and the vibrancy in our lives and the affirmation of all of that in our lives is really important, and it makes me incredibly grateful to make a part of this event here today. When I saw the theme for this HESED lecture series, Reclaiming Our Stories, I knew immediately that our film would be a great addition to the series, and I was thankful for the recommendation of Reverend Crystal McCormick, who helped us get here. HESED has many meanings, but one that I like specifically is steadfast love. And that is what Reclaiming Our Stories does. Reclaiming our stories as a theme, but also as a deep spiritual practice, is absolutely necessary. It allows us to undo the damages done by ageism, elitism, homophobia, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, and all. We can keep going down and down. Reclaiming our stories undoes that harm. And so we need to reclaim our stories to undo the distortions that these hates do in the world and in our own lives. The great writer Audre Lorde says that it is a lifetime pursuit for each one of us to extract these distortions from our lives. It takes a lifetime. But also that we must explore what these differences can teach us about the future that we all share together. She goes on to say that this is urgent because the distortions that these hates do on us are endemic in our society and will ultimately lead us to downfall. So when we reclaim our stories, we embrace all of who we are and all of who everyone else is. And this allows us to live intensely. Because as Audre Lorde also says, there is no separate survival. We need each other. And we need each other to undo the negative stereotypes of ourselves and to undo negative theology that gives us stereotypes of God. James Cone argues that our ideas about God are not separate from life and arise from our lived realities. And Frantz Fanon says that the evidence of the person of African descent is the fact of blackness. The fact of blackness is a lived experience of the person of African descent, of the black person. And so those two ideas together remind us that traditional depictions of God often arise from certain lived realities, but have deep impact into our lives. And so these traditional depictions of God, often as a white male figure with a long beard, can become so ingrained that they lower the lived experiences of people of color. This film, what our film does, Faith in Blackness, it invites us to see with a transformative lens, allowing us to hear stories by Black lives and therefore embrace a more expansive, inclusive understanding of God. And this not only enriches our own spiritual lives, but also empowers us to combat injustice and to embrace the diverse stories of all of humanity. So I am thankful that you are here to watch this film. And I am thankful that it is part of reclaiming stories, because reclaiming stories ultimately lead us to a greater sense of unity, which leads us closer and closer to the divine. Our film is a short film that explores the dynamism of Black faith, specifically by learning from AfroLatine perspectives. And I believe that this can help us embrace our uniqueness. As you see the participants in our film reclaim their stories, that you feel inspired to reclaim yours as well. Enjoy the film. Thank you.
Once again, at this time, if we would bring some questions to just, yes, sir. Yes.
I'm sure.
Oh yeah. If you have any questions, please, they're all welcome, and we'll do our best to answer them. They are going to pass around microphones, and we'll just take turns answering questions. We'd like to start.
Or any thoughts or comments, reactions to the film would be great.
In embracing duality, do you lose something of one or the other?
Well, I think what we're trying to show is that there is no difference, there is no two. I think that I was born in Colombia. I am a very black person. My identity is black. I don't think that there's a difference in, there is no second other. I believe it goes with what W.B. Du Bois says about double consciousness or triple. My mentor called the triple consciousness, right? And then I always say that for Christians, we have quadruple consciousness. How do you deal with the fact that you're black and that you're in this country and that you also have another country that's called Latino and that you're also a spiritual person and Christian? I don't feel there's a either or. I actually feel there's just an integral way in which all of it intersects. So if you saw Paulina there who says she's like, whenever I go around, I like my Muslim identity to be known, I let my Latinidad be known, I let my blackness be known, because it's an intersection of who I am. I don't think that there's any losing of one. I think there's a different emphasis in which the way that blackness shows up, let's say in a Colombian context, right? So I was born in Colombia. Blackness has a different way in which it may show up than it does show up here. But I don't think it's a choosing of one or the other. I will tell you though that as an immigrant, growing up in the States here, I mean, I grew up here. We moved here when I was 10. I did go more towards my black friends, my African-American friends. But also then I realized there were Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, from the continent of Africa. Like they were from all over. They're just black. Because I think my lived reality, right? This is why I quoted Frantz Fanon earlier. The lived experience of the black person really informs our reality. And you know, whenever I go around the street, no one's questioning if I'm Colombian. They're first interacting with a dark-skinned man. And then, if I say hablo española, oh, wait, hold on. What does that mean? So I think for us, I think it's living onto that, right? And making sure that all of those things live within us. And I think one of the things that we try to highlight in the film is how all of that for them lives in different ways. Now, in the Afro-Latino community, Afro-Latina community, there are people who are very anti-black, who deny their own blackness, right? So Pew Research did a study that 6 million, they estimated 6 million Latinos in this country identify as black. 1 million of those also think that they're white. So interesting, that's an interesting concept. But that happens because of the level of anti-blackness that exists through our Latin American Latinidad, right? So like, there's, in Latino context, there's a different idea, same idea of white supremacy masked under something called mestizaje. And so then that allows everyone to believe that everyone's mixed, therefore we're all come from three things: indigenous, European, African. And so then there's a deepened anti-blackness that comes as part of the Latino experience that it takes root here in the US. And so then I do think that there does take a shift, and we wanted to show that in the film too. Like you saw Jose, who's a really good friend of mine, who said, it was my therapist who helped me discover or realize that I was black. And then you see someone like Yvette, that she was like, I was immersed in blackness the moment I was born. And so I think those are true perspectives that happen in our Afro-Latino communities.
Dr. Claire has a question.
Thank you so much for this film. One of the phrases that stuck out is this notion of decolonizing spirituality. And I'm wondering if you've given any more thought to the decolonizing of this binary between white being light and dark being evil. That binary that I think is played on so much within European-informed Christianities. When we think of light, we think of whiteness, and when we think of evil, we think of blackness. I'm wondering if that binary plays out in what you mean by decolonizing spirituality.
Yeah. This is a weird, shameless plug, but I did just recently do an interview with Sojourners, and they asked me a question on this. I'm going to quote it, but if you want to read some of my thoughts on deconstructing and decolonizing, it was recently in Sojourners. I I think the work of decolonizing is really difficult to do, and it takes a long time. I actually think it's communal. I think that when colonization was a communal enterprise, it was not one person. It was a bunch of people together colonize a bunch of people. And I think, therefore, the work of decolonization has to be communal. We have to do it together. It has to be done together. That's why I mentioned Audre Lorde earlier, who says our survival is not by our own. We need one another to survive and to thrive and to live. So I do think that in the work of decolonizing and then therefore deconstructing, right? I think deconstructing, and I say this in that Sojourner's article, deconstructing is a more individual enterprise. You can deconstruct aspects of your experience, aspects of how you were raised, aspects of what you've learned. But to decolonize, you need a village. Like, it just can't happen by yourself. You can start on your own, but you need a village. And what I think, and especially in religious spaces, what we need to do is we need a lot of, as a theologian, quasi-theologian, we need a lot of theological humility. Like, I think we're not honest with the fact that Christianity is more Asian and African origin religion than it is a European religion, right? So if we just stick to Christianity, like, we just don't say these things. We continue to replicate the lies that were told to us, that, like, for example, that the early church mothers and church fathers, they were somewhere in the desert. Yeah, the desert was like in Africa. The desert was like in Asia. Like, it's not a random desert. And I say that because we have to together start to problematize and end the lies that have been told to us for a long time. That's the only way that we can decolonize any space, right? Because James Baldwin says that American society's belief on race lies in the belief of the lie. And the lie will continue to replicate itself and does it through people and does it through others and does it through whatever. And then he says, we also sometimes corroborate the lie because then we support it in different ways, right? So we have to stop corroborating the lie. We have to be like, no, actually, Jesus was actually Palestinian Jew. And then there's people like, well, no, does that mean no? Actually, yeah, no, that's actually the reality. Whatever you want to say, the other thing you want to say is the lie. This is the truth. And I think that we don't do that enough and I'm going to challenge us in Christian dominant spaces, because we do in our minds believe in the lie. Audre Lorde calls it in our minds that we have the mythical other, meaning there is an other in our mind who we think is the majority, and we live with that in our mind. And what Audre Lorde says, we have to get rid of the mythical other so that there is no mythical other, so that we can just point to like whatever the truth is. So if we corroborate the lie, like what James Baldwin says, that society lives, that America, specifically talking about race, believes on this lie, of course, the white majority and white supremacy over, and we say we don't, but then in our minds, if we do and we operate on that, then we're corroborating that. So when we get to religious spaces, I think we just have to be more honest, right? Like I always say, like, that Christianity is an Eastern religion. People are like, no, it's not. I'm like, actually, it is. By definitions that were put on it by Western standards, Christianity would be an Eastern religion. And Christianity's origins are actually much more Eastern, right? It's only after 313, you all who are here studying church history know this, right? It's after Constantine that it shifted. But then there was a mass exodus of people who were like, I'm not going to support that kind of Christianity. We don't tell those stories. We kind of just go like, oh yeah, and then that happened, and then the empire went, and then the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne, and then we go down this path, but we forget about the other path. One of the things I was reading recently is Faith in the Face of Empire, a Palestinian reading of the Bible. And the writer there says, Mitri Raheb says that when we study Christianity, we kind of stop after Rome, after 313, to look at Palestine. Like, we're like, Jesus died, that's it. That's as much as we need to learn about the Palestinian story. Now we move on to Europe. So we have to be the ones who fill in those gaps and who don't corroborate the lie, who combat the lie. And that's the one way that I think we can do color. But that takes all of us doing it together. One here and then.
That was a phenomenal film. It's something that I wish I would have seen in high school or even middle school. So my question for you is, are you trying to put this film in high schools or middle schools with the discussion? Because your discussion is phenomenal as well. And I feel like it's something that needs to be in all schools. It's a celebration, and it needs to start earlier So that's my question, if you're trying to get it in schools.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we do actually want to. So we have. Let me get very technical. So the song that you heard, the main salsa song that plays there, Las Caras Lindas de mi Gente Negra, which for those who don't speak Spanish translates as the beautiful faces of my black people. It's a iconic song in Afro-Latino communities. Like, it's one of the, it talks about the beautiful faces of my black people. Right? It's a beautiful song, it's an iconic song. The fact that we were able to get the rights to that song is really big. So they gave us a year of the song. And so then after a year, we renegotiate. They want to talk, questions about money. So we just have to talk to them. After that year is when we can release the film. So we're going to talk with them about giving us access to release the film, giving us access to put the song in the film in schools. However, if they say no, then we already have a song that we're going to replace it with. But the goal is after this year, because usually, just in a very technical thing, I've learned this. I'm not a filmmaker, although I helped make this film, but films usually do like a year run when they're like indie films and go around and do events like this and other things. And then you put it somewhere for people to access. So we will actually, our goal is to actually just have it live on our website. We have a website called faithandblackness.com. And in that website, we also have a study guide for it that we were already thinking of, like schools and different places, so that when it does become freely available, that people can just get it, they can also download the study guide and read and are able to watch the film and have some things to study with. So that is the goal. So we do hope to do that. And we actually have partnered with some schools showing it, like doing screenings like this that we have done and shown it to some schools. We hope to do more.
Awesome. Lastly, I would like to say, I won't be here to see it, but it needs to be in schools and available for the next 400 to 500 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you mentioned in the process of decolonizing faith, do you ever feel like a villain? And how do you process that?
Do I ever feel like the villain? Or like a villain?
Yeah.
I don't. I think early on, I will tell you that I think, early on in the process of deconstruction and decolonizing, I think decolonizing takes a long time, which is why we end the film with saying, like, it's a journey, it has a start, but I don't know if it has an end. Like, it's a long time and it takes a long time. Because colonization takes a long time, and I would argue that colonization is not finished, just like decolonizing doesn't end. Like, it's a constant battle. I think that early on you do feel a little bit like I'm going the wrong way. Like, I think early on I remember feeling, but for me early on, thankfully it was really early, was like when I was like 10, 11. My father had put me to preach, so I grew up Pentecostal. And my father had put me to preach in churches when I was like 10. I don't even know what I was saying. 10-year-old me saying in churches, I have no clue. But that's what I was doing. I was going around churches and preaching. But I remember very early on, so my father was a lawyer. And so he was always a more critical reader than his colleagues in churches. And he would always make sure that I was a critical reader and that I was like interrogating scripture and what are you reading there? Do some background on that, read this other person. And so I remember very early on, it was around 12 when I was starting to ask questions that people didn't like. And yeah, I did feel like a villain, like I was wrong. But I knew deep inside me I wasn't wrong. I was like, I just don't have the language yet. And I remember feeling that, I remember the specific thing that happened at 13 years old. I was studying the end times. I was a minister at 16. So a lot of that I identify a lot with James Baldwin, actually, because James Baldwin was a preacher very young. If you know his story, and James Baldwin also left the church very young because he was like, I saw some evil things, I'm out. So I identify with that because I became a minister at 16. And I was helping with weddings at 17, which is crazy. I'm not. But I remember, so that's why some of the stories are young. So anyway, at 14, I remember asking some questions, and I remember someone telling me, you asked too many questions. And I remember my father telling me, you ask all the questions you want. Don't let them tell you not to ask these questions, right? My father's a very proud black man, the first black man to graduate from his law school in Colombia. Experienced a lot of racism in that law school. He was like, you ask all the questions you want, and you ask all the questions that you need to have. So I think early on, I knew that I had good questions. I just didn't know what that was. And then I kept learning, and then reading more and being like, so this person just has half of the truth. And that, but I remember being labeled in my church denomination as, I remember they told my pastor, the Because I was a minister, again, really young. So I was already in the ministerial ranks. And those of you who are ministers know that ministers talk about other ministers. So I told the person who was my pastor that I was, what is it they said? That I was unwieldy or something like that. And he told me that. And I'm like 17. I'm like, what? All right, whatever then, okay. And I remember then I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to stay here. Like, this is not going to fit here for a long time. So there was a time where I felt weird. And then there were times when I did it wrongly, when I was like very cocky and I would go around because I knew that I knew more. That was really wrong, and that was a past life before me. But then a really good pastor told me one time, was like, you know, some of the things you say are correct, and some of the questions you ask are good, but it's difficult to go against tradition. And that was really wise, actually, because then I stopped this fight that I was doing, like, head on. So, yeah, there were times when I felt like a villain, I think, until I was like 17, 18. And then after that, I was like, oh, then I remember changing my perspective. I was like, oh, it's just a different thing. So, yeah, that's a good question, I think, early on.
So, this will be the last question.
Yeah, so how are you seeing, the film, what the film's about, play out as a movement in the midst of rising nationalism, that sentiment, right? But also this arrival of migration, and people coming with a lot of faith, right? They're showing up, and so there's we're not sure what to do with that, right? But I think this is very inspiring because I think it's finding the right language, especially for churches that are kind of at the intersection of that. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that because of many different. So I think AfroLatinidad lives in this like liminal space of Latinidad and Blackness, right? Where there are people who don't understand who we are from either, let's say, African American sides. Just use that as a denominator here in the U.S. And then from Latino perspectives, which the denominator here in the U.S. is more mestizo identity, right? That's more, and mestizo, for those of you that don't know, is like an indigenous mixed with white person kind of identity that is the majority in Latin America. So that is the white majority, like that's the majority. And so because of that, I think because of this liminal space, I think it's important for people who live in these liminal spaces to tell their own stories, right? And so I think that was one of the reasons. When we set out to do this film, we didn't set out to make a film. We actually were just recording oral stories. I was telling David yesterday that we were reclaiming stories because, so this film is part of something called the AfroLatine Theology Project, which you saw. It's also connected to something called Afro-Latino Forum, Afro-Latino Forum, which is the nonprofit that I run that centers Blackness when discussing Latinidad. But Afro-Latine Theology Project, the idea is to include more voices of people of color, specifically Black Latinos in Latino theological spaces, because those of you who identify as Latino know that there's not a lot of conversations around Blackness in those spaces. Like, there's just none. And so we wanted to find a language, and we wanted to be the ones to tell that story. The reason why I say that is because I think what we need to do is be informed by people's stories, especially people living in the liminal spaces, right? And so I think with what we've seen with the film is that there's definitely different reactions to the film in different places, right? It does actually problematize for people in a good way the way in which we understand immigration, right? So that we understand immigration mostly in the narrative of the U.S. I don't know how it is in Texas, so I'm going to be very specific that this is what I hear in New York, right? What I hear in Brooklyn is that the way we identify immigration is really as more like indigenous-looking folk that are coming across the border. That's usually kind of the way that the narrative in the news gets spoken about, which is that's a majority of people. There are some people that come like that, but there are also Black migrants. There's also a huge influx of Black migrants from all over the world. And one of the things that's interesting that you said is that many of those migrants, a lot of the newcomers, I like that word better, a lot of the newcomers are actually people of faith, right? Of deep, I would say Catholic faith mostly, if not other Christian descendant traditions. And it's interesting how they're met in a Christian country with not the love that the Christian theology discusses. And actually, I would recommend that you read the stories in McCord, because those stories were really powerful. I read all of those stories yesterday about just people writing their stories, and some of them say that, like, this country talks about love and freedom, but doesn't really use love and freedom. There's a lot of that. So what I've seen in here, what we've seen with the film is that because the film doesn't necessarily show any negative aspects of Blackness or any negative aspects of like stories, that people welcome those stories much better. We made it a purpose that we weren't going to show something called like what in black circles sometimes you call trauma porn or like slave trauma porn, which is like whenever you reference slavery, you need to show some sort of image of slavery, right? Like that's a thing. It's actually like a thing in film. Like I remember we showed this film to some film people, and they were like, "You got to show an image of slavery." I was like, "No, we don't. We're not going to show that. Like we're not. You don't need to see that." I know that it's powerful sometimes to do that, and I was just sharing that I did a Visio Divina with an image of a black Brazilian Christ. Different purpose though. For this film, I wasn't going to do that, right? We weren't going to do that. We made that decision. And so what that has done, it has led to really rich conversations about the beauty and love that people feel in Blackness. And I think also in Latino communities, it has then started to make people ask questions. I didn't know there were that many number of Latinos around, of black Latinos in the world. Like the reason why we use the number, I mean, that is actually a number. Over 90% of people who survive Middle Passage, right? The word that we say in black communities for the transatlantic slave trade, who survived that, went to Latin America and the Caribbean. That's not to lower like another Blackness. It's just to show you the numbers that we're dealing with. We're dealing with, I think the UN now estimates 200 million people in Latin America are of African descent. Now that they count themselves as of being Afro-descendant, that's a whole different story because of the concept of whiteness and mestizaje and the idea that people are told not to select black or this. We do a lot of census work in the work that I do in the Afro-Latino Forum, and so what we notice is there's something called statistical genocide, in which we're going to erase a certain number of a population, so you don't even know that they exist, and then therefore those numbers don't count. So they're there, but it's statistically they're not there, and that happens all the time. So what we've seen is there's a lot of good conversation about the amount of people who are of African descent in Latino spaces, and then the more that I have these conversations, the more that people are like, you know what, yes, you know what, some newcomers that went to my church are people of African descent and actually came from Haiti or the Dominican Republic or from wherever they, you know, and so it's a very interesting way in which the film has allowed that. Well, we really hope that the film shows that there's two things that we say that we wanted the film to do, which is to spark conversations on just the reclaiming of the image of God in everyone, right? That we all have the image of God, and actually collectively we have the image of God. There's not one image. God can look like you individually, but also like us collectively. And what does that mean? And then the other one is, how do we then, by hearing these stories, how are people then encouraged to share their own stories, right? And to show their stories in which their identity plays a role in their faith, and their faith plays a role in their identities. So I hope that answers the question a bit, but yes.
This is how we reclaim our story. Josue Perea.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josue, for this gift you bring to our community. We really appreciate it. Friends, now we're going to go into a time of a break. We're going to have about a 15-minute break. We'll meet back here at 11:15. And we invite you to come outside and explore some of the exhibits that are out there. One of them is the HESED exhibit. There's pictures from past year HESEDs, so you can see this historic event through a different lens. There's also Alejandro Salazar art exhibit, who's like right here in the hallway that you can come look at. And then finally we have the Arte de Lágrimas exhibit by our very own esteemed Dr. Cuellar. So yeah. I'll meet you here at 11:15, and we'll kick off our keynote then. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, David.